Wei Yingwu, Autumn Night. A letter to Officer Chiu. Thinking of you this autumn night, strolling, declaiming to the cold sky, among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain. Alone, like me, you won't be sleeping. So we continue with a poem by Wei Yingwu. This is his last poem in the anthology. Wei Yingwu, like Liu Changqing, is one of the silver category poets in this anthology. He has the exact same number of poems in it than Liu Changqing, which is 11, although his poems are much more concentrated into what must have been felt to be his specialty, the old style, I think it was pentasyllabic poems, where we encountered 7 at least out of those 11 poems by Wei Jingwu. Yeah, it was in the 5-word old style poems. I've just checked it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. So Wei Jing was also a poet, again, like Liu Changqing, we could say, of a transitional period from the High Tang to from the late High Tang to the early Mid Tang. He personally served under Emperor Xuanzong during his later years, but most of his poetic production comes from the second half of the 8th century. Now, going on to this poem, specifically, I managed to find a little bit more of information about it in another book that I have, which is not the anthology of 300 Tang poems, but a complete translation of all Wei Jingwu's poems, the poetry of Wei Jingwu in such hard times, translated by Red Pine. And in that, in the notes to that poem, I'll read that version of the poem later. It says the following: the poem was written in the fall of 789 in Suzhou. The person to whom the poem is in a way dedicated, this Officer Chiu, would have been Chiu Tan, who had served briefly as Wei's secretary. His title, which in Red Pine's version is Autumn Night to Supernumerary Chiu 22. So the title suggests that he had been appointed to a post beyond the quota permitted and would therefore receive only half the allotted salary. Chu decided he would rather cultivate the Tao. He quit his post, crossed the Yangtze, and retired to a hermitage on Pingshan, just outside of the northwestern gate of Yangzhou. So we see very clearly that the poem is dedicated to a friend or a person who had worked under Wei Jingwu, who had abandoned the world and who was living the retired life. In fact, this helps to clarify a reference which appears in line 3, which we will comment in a minute, the pine cones. Now, pine cones, I think we've encountered this in a previous poem. Pine cones are an important source of food in ancient China for recluses, and therefore their evocation here clearly establishes, even for the lay reader who knew the conventions, that this Officer Chu must be living the recluse life, the retired life, in some way or other. So what's the topic of the poem? Well, the title very clearly seems to point in the direction that it's a seasonal poem, so Autumn Night. Remember, the vast majority of Chinese poems that reference the seasons, which are many, mostly about autumn or spring, which are the 2 seasons that are more aesthetically inspiring for the tradition. Especially autumn, I would say, even a little bit more than spring. And autumn has always this sad, melancholy tone. So a poem set in autumn and set in an autumn night will always, have these tinges, these overtones of melancholy and sadness that should start conditioning the mind of the reader even before he starts with the specific poem itself. Also typical of autumn is the moon, especially the harvest moon. I think it's the moon in the 8th month, or in the middle of the 8th month, which is presumed to be the biggest and most beautiful moon of the year. It's also a time of celebration in classical China, where people had meetings with their families. So it would have been especially poignant moon to see when you were separated, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, from your relatives. So I wouldn't say the autumn element is really present a lot in this poem, except as a background. So there is this seasonal element, but the main element, I'd say, would be the topic of wakefulness at night, which we've encountered a lot, connected with the topic of being separated, of parting, separation between friends. So wakefulness at night, we've encountered a lot of times. The poet, the poetic persona cannot sleep and thinks. Well, this sleeplessness is probably motivated either for political worries, personal worries, or the missing of a lover or a close friend. And along with this, there is a common topic in these poems where you imagine that the other person is also sleepless, especially if there's a beautiful moon. In all of these poems, we have the poetic persona looking at the moon and thinking the other person, my friend who's far away, is probably also sleepless and looking at the same moon right now, and we're connected by this common moon gazing. So topics of the poem, as I said, there's a seasonal element if you wish, but the main topics are wakefulness at night, sadness at being separated from a friend, and there's this slight element of the retired life that the absent friend is supposed to be living, and which is illustrated very indirectly through an image of the poem. So let's take a look at the couplets. First couplet. Thinking of you this autumn night, strolling, declaiming to the cold sky. So the poem starts with Wei Yingwu. He is wakeful at night. He's walking around. It's an autumn night, so it's cold. Not cold as winter, but there's a coolness that is always associated with autumn. And the poet seems to be alone. He is walking around and he is reciting. He is declaiming to the cold sky. So remember, reading poetry is an eminent, reciting poetry is an eminently social activity in classical China, and it's one of the activities that scholar officials did when they were together. But here, the poet is lonely. He would like probably to recite these poems in the company of his friend who is far away. So while I am doing this, second couplet, among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain. So I'm strolling, declaiming to the cold sky among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain. So this is interesting. In the way this poem is translated, it seems to be clear that the one who is among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain is Wei Jingwu. Although, actually, in the English interpretation, I think you could read it in two ways, depending on how you interpret the comma after the first line. So, is it Wei Jingwu who is thinking of his friend in this autumn night while he is strolling, declaiming to the cold sky among falling pine cones on an empty mountain? Or, after thinking of you this autumn night, the person who is strolling, declaiming to the cold sky among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain, is that person the other person, Officer Chu? So I think the English translation permits both interpretations. I'm pretty sure the original Chinese, with its typical ambiguity, permits both readings. My feeling is that the second one is probably the better one. That is to say, Wei Jingwu is awake, but he's probably not outside. He's probably, in his pavilion, whatever. And he is imagining his friend strolling, declaiming among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain. Why? Because of what we said earlier. His friend is living the retired life. He is a hermit. He is a recluse. So it would make sense for his friend to be on an empty mountain. In fact, he was in one of these mountain complexes of which we've talked before. I think it was the Pingshan was the location of the Daming temple, and the slopes of Pingshan would not have been exactly deserted, but they would have been a religious retirement place. So among the falling pine cones on an empty mountain is probably his friend, or he imagines, Wei Jingwu is imagining his friend, maybe among the pine cones which he uses as a source of sustenance, so a rustic food, and alone on the empty mountain. Last line, alone like me, you won't be sleeping. So the whole poem, you could say, is constructed on this imagination, on this view with the eyes of the heart, or with the eyes of the mind, or with the eyes of dream, in which Wei Jingwu is seeing Officer Chu, or writing this poem as part of a letter. That's what the title says, although we have no element of epistolary evidence in the short poem itself. But you might imagine at the end or in the middle of the letter, this poem would have been included with the imaginations of Wei Yingwu at the moment of writing them, imagining how his friend would be doing. So lovely poem, really. You get this wakefulness at night of Wei Yingwu and he's imagining his friend alone in the mountain amidst the pine cones, reciting poetry, feeling slightly cold, unable to sleep because of his sadness at separation from friends, especially in the saddest season of the year and in the saddest period of that season. So, quite a nice poem, quite a nice cap to all of Wei Jingwu's poetry. And to conclude, as I said before, I'll read the other version of the poem by Red Pine. Out walking and singing of cooler days, I think of you on this autumn night. Pine cones falling on deserted slopes, the recluse I suspect not yet asleep.